Today, we are going to be discussing consensus and the consensus process. What exactly is consensus?
Consensus is a collective and cooperative decision-making process where there's an effort to try to bring people together to a common or shared decision that everyone can embrace and feel good about.
Does consensus mean that this only works if we all agree?
Consensus is not unanimity. That is to say, it doesn't mean we all agree. Consensus can be a process for getting to the best possible decision for a group of people, bringing in different opinions and modifying the decision as you go through the process to get a decision that becomes more and more honed or tuned to the harmony of the group, if you will.
How does consensus process differ from other decision-making processes, such as majority rule?
The purpose of a consensus-oriented process is to create a decision that works well for the group as a whole and all the participants in the group. You know, if we think about other decision-making processes, sometimes the purpose is making a quick decision or having whoever has the most support to make a decision. But consensus works on trying to make a decision that involves all the participants in the group and supports all of their interests. One of the problems with majority rule is that sometimes large groups of people are left as losers, and oftentimes majority rule can push groups of people apart, whereas consensus tries to bring people together. Consensus seeks to say, well, how do we make sense of our different interests to come up with a decision that works for all of us? And there's a real art to doing that all of the participants have to engage in to do it well. It creates decisions that are stronger, that don't have people who are disgruntled and trying to sabotage them.
What does consensus process look like in a rainbow context?
Oftentimes the process starts with someone making a proposal. After a proposal has been made, it's a good idea to have some time for open discussion, where people can say whatever they're thinking, what works about it or what doesn't work about it. And through that discussion, the proposal can be modified.
If there's a lot of people around, are there some good ways of communicating if you agree a lot or disagree or kind of so-so?
People might twinkle with their fingers pointing upwards, both hands raised up, and their fingers wiggling back and forth. Up twinkles for agreement, and if their hands point down, with their fingers pointing down and wiggling, that down twinkling can indicate disagreement. Pointed at the horizon, middle twinkles means I'm not sure, and anywhere in between is somewhat support, somewhat disagree. It's helpful to let people know what everyone else in the group is thinking.
If we're all trying to get on the same page, what are the different ways to effectively disagree?
The choice isn't between consensus or no consensus, but it's a spectrum of choices. In a formal consensus process, you might ask for different types of responses, right? Are there any concerns, major objections, minor objections, stand-asides, or blocks? Do you have some concerns still that haven't been voiced in the discussion? Do you have full-on objections, like a minor objection, some little thing, well, if we only tweak this, I'd be happy with it? Or a major objection, this is a big thing that's going to get in the way. Or stand-asides, where you just say, yeah, I don't agree, but I'm not going to block.
Let's try to clarify those with an example. Let's say we're in council and someone makes a proposal such as, I propose that we have quiet hours after midnight in the kitchen. They hand the talking stick to the left, it starts around the circle. What might be some examples of those different ways to disagree?
In the example of the quiet hours, a concern might be, oh, well, Jammin' Joe is not at this meeting, and I know Jammin' Joe walks by here at 1 o'clock every morning, making a lot of noise on their banjo. We need to communicate this to Jammin' Joe. That's a concern. That's not like I'm blocking the consensus. I'm in favor of the consensus, but here's the concern that we're going to run into if we don't deal with it. Maybe the minor objections. Well, what if there's a fire in the camp? Then we need to make noise. Okay, that's easy enough. Sure, we all agree. If there's a fire in the camp, we need to make noise. A major objection might be something like, oh, but I scheduled my band to play here at 1 o'clock on Tuesday night. That won't work, That might take a little more working out. Or stand-asides, where you just say, yeah, I don't agree with the quiet hours, but I'm willing to go along because it's what the group wants to do. So I'll stand aside and let the consensus go ahead without me getting in the way of the decision. Ultimately, there's at the far end of that continuum of where you might stand, there's a position of actually actively saying, no, I want to keep this decision from happening and I'm blocking it. And when there's full-on disagreement, maybe you're Jam and Joe, for instance, and this is your place to play every night at 1 o'clock, well, there is a place for people to block.
Can a block be used as a bargaining tool? I was once in a circle where a person threatened to block all proposals unless they got their way.
Well, there's a certain absurdity to that, right? Consensus is a cooperative process. It's not a manipulative process. However well-meaning someone might be to say, I'm going to block everything until I get my way, they're basically saying, I'm going to abandon consensus process for a different process of I get my way. That's not what consensus is about. It's not about people throwing their block into the group and saying, hey, I want to stop this. But it's about more of the other things. I want to let you know that this part works for me, this part doesn't. I want to try to amend this part to make it work better. And again, the make it work better is really the goal, not make it what I want, but make it work better for everyone. And then you have decisions that are stronger because you don't have defectors.
In actual practice, are blocks something that happen a lot?
As a general rule, blocks should happen very rarely, if at all. You generally don't want to block consensus just because something doesn't work for you. That might be a major objection or a concern. There are some approaches to consensus that put limits on what kinds of things can be the basis of blocks. Whatever your justification for blocking, I would argue you want to do it as little as possible, and you want to do it only when you feel like it really is important for the well-being of the group.
If there's a block, does that mean the consensus process has failed?
Sometimes we're all heading up the mountain and one of our family gets too exhausted and can't go any farther and has to block the continuing of the group going up the hill. If we're going to support our family, we have to respect that block, and sometimes it should be the thing that stops the movement towards a decision. Sometimes later people realize that block was the best thing that happened because it brought clarity that wasn't there before and insight into what's really important and what really matters to us. Sometimes a single voice can be the voice that helps everyone realize that. So sometimes blocks are very valuable.
So how do you figure out if you actually have consensus?
Typically, you've had some discussion, voices have been heard, and it seems like maybe everyone's congealing around the decision. When you feel like you're getting close to a consensus, it's sometimes helpful to articulate, to say what you think the consensus is, and then at a certain point you might test for consensus. You might ask the group, is there consensus? Do we all agree about this? Any concerns, minor objections, major objections, stand-asides, or blocks? You ask if there are any of those things, and you may go around the circle. As you go around, if there's no blocks, but there's a bunch of stand-asides and a bunch of major objections and minor objections, then the decision probably isn't ready to be made. Sometimes people will test with silence.
So, for example, a test might be someone saying out loud, consensus by silence, if you would like to have quiet hours at midnight.
And then you give time for anyone to come forward. Some of us are quicker than others to come forward, so it's always a question of how much silence you want. But silence is one way of testing for consensus, but there are more active ways, right? So I think sometimes at rainbow gatherings we'll just pass a feather, and if it goes around and no one says anything, then that clearly means there's a consensus.
Can you talk a little bit about what to do in the case where someone actually does block consensus?
If someone makes a decision to block, a group has a number of options. Sometimes, though, it's worth approaching someone one-on-one, right? I mean, I think that's often a good way to deal with a block, is not to make it the group as a whole issue, but to say, all right, maybe I'm the person who proposed and you're the person who's blocking. Well, why don't the two of us go off and talk, and then we're not taking everyone else's time about it, and see if the two of us can come to an agreement. Maybe you say, let's send 3 people from each group if there's 2 groups of opinions, right? If you need to, you bring a couple of people from the middle who are able to be good listeners and supporters of everyone's position. If you have a major objection, that's something to work through. If you have a block, you're sort of saying, I don't know how to work through this. It seems like there's no way to resolve this. Sometimes you do have to say, well, the 3 of us want this and the 6 of us want that. Maybe we should go our separate ways. That sometimes is the best decision that a group can make. So sometimes you've done all the work you can and that decision can't go forward until a way around that block is found. There's no one way to do it. The thing about a block is it also doesn't end the process. It says, let's go back and keep working.
Well, thank you very much for working with me to help clarify the consensus process. At this time, I'd like to propose that we cease this interview. Are there any concerns? Are there any minor objections? Major objections? Stand-asides or blocks? Consensus by 5 seconds of silence.
To find detailed information on consensus and the consensus process, we highly recommend On Conflict and Consensus, a handbook on formal consensus decision-making by C.T. Butler and Amy Rothstein from Food Not Bombs Publishing. Available at archive.org and also at theanarchistlibrary.org. See you in 20 minutes.